So there was plenty of crossover with those who have experience of being a gang member. So yeah, that's a bit about my experience.
Thank you, Laura. So I have just started the recording. Just for your information, we will make copies of the slides available with the recording after this event. So just before we get into looking at the evidence then, apologies, can people see just the slides? That's all right. So the evidence information that we're going to talk through today comes from national and international sources, and it's worth noting that this can be of really quite mixed quality. We know it is predominantly focused on males, although there is an emerging evidence base about girls in gangs, and we will touch on that during this presentation. We also know that defining gangs has been a challenge in the past. We know words and phrases can be quite emotive and they do mean different things to different people. And as a result, that lack of clarity or consistency in understanding about people in groups, people who offend and engage in harmful group behaviour, can result in stereotypical assumptions being made. So when we look at gangs, we use the definition from the Ending Gang and Youth Violence paper, which talks about street and youth gangs are a relatively durable, predominantly street-based group of young people who see themselves and are seen by others as a discernible group, who engage in a range of criminal activity and violence, who identify with or lay claim over a territory and have some form of identifying structural feature, and typically are in conflict with other similar gangs. What we know is that offending that's related to someone being part of a group is not readily identifiable either by their conviction nor by whether or not they have co-defendants. And something else that adds to the difficulty is that markers that we might use to identify those with group affiliation are used inconsistently across different parts of the criminal justice system and across academic research. But despite all of that, what we can see is some consistency and some emerging themes in the findings, which is what we're going to present to you today.
Okay, so firstly, we want to take you through why people are attracted to gangs, so to the gang lifestyle, what the gang offers for them in the immediate and long-term instances of their attachment to that gang, and what really keeps them there. So once they've engaged within that gang, what actually keeps their membership live almost. So if we could have the next slide. So firstly, we'd like you to visualize a gang member. So think about in your mind what a typical gang member looks like. What do you imagine motivates them as they get up in the morning? What are their values? What do they enjoy? What are they like? How do they talk? How do they move? What really drives them on a day-to-day basis? So keep hold of that image, so who they are, what they're about. Street gang members are typically aged 10 to 25, and their ethnicity is reflective of their local area. So when you started building up that visualization of the gang member, how many of you actually pictured a child? The Crime Survey for England and Wales 2018 suggests that 3,021 children aged 10 to 15 is either a gang member or knows someone who is a gang member. And 12,092 adults aged 16 to 24 is either a member or knows someone who's a member of a gang. Go back to your image now. Do you see someone who's anxious? Do you see someone who's depressed? Do you see someone who's a victim of trauma? Evidence shows that those with gang involvement have more complex needs. So what we know is they will have higher instances of anxiety, depression, victimization, and exploitation, both inside and outside of the home. So when you look at the evidence, I now ask you to replace the original image that you had in your mind and replace that with the stark reality that we know. And that gang member is a vulnerable child or young adult in need of protection. Holding that perspective will really allow you to delve into understanding exactly why an individual is drawn into a gang and what keeps them there once they're in it. There's a tendency in society, we know, to view young people involved with gangs as a sign of lifestyle choice and criminality. We often fail to see that vulnerability, that the depths of that vulnerability and the experience that individuals have within their life. And we tend to move away from the image or the understanding and appreciation of that child or young adult in need of protection, which ultimately that is what we're working with. So moving on to think about why people join gangs, it's often not as simplistic as we might assume. So joining and remaining in a gang involves several factors, which are often intertwined. Research suggests that joining youth gangs consists of variables that fall into push factors. So when we're talking about push factors, we're talking about individuals that are pushed into gangs because of negative outside factors and perhaps social conditions as well. And then we have our pull factors, where individuals are pulled into gangs because the group offers perceived benefits. So these are wide ranging, but certain highlights of those benefits tend to be that sense of belonging that that individual is searching for, a perception that that group can offer that safety and security that they're desperate to feel. Or alternatively, that excitement, that thrill, that sensation seeking that they're looking for. And also thinking about financial opportunities, that there is that perception that that gang will provide financial benefit. And those are really some of the key and significant pull factors that we see when we work with the group members that we work with. So when we look at individual factors, we can also appreciate that factors such as ethnicity, age, hyperactivity, low self-esteem, and substance abuse may also increase someone's vulnerability and susceptibility to being drawn into gang membership. Female gang members share common risk factors and motivations for gang affiliation and joining and engaging with a gang. However, the transition into a gang and the experience of a gang and the conditions of that gang membership are slightly different for our female gang members. And a lot of that is characterised by the exploitations that they experience, so being used as a tool in gang rivalries, and often being having experiences of domestic abuse within their relationships with other gang members during their time within the gang. Over to you, Vikki.
Thank you, Laura. So what we know is those push and pulls can be part of that biopsychosocial development and that reciprocal relationship, and the process that people go through when becoming involved with and forming commitments to a group can be kind of gradual or rapid, and they might form either kind of strong bonds to that group and other times it's weaker. But essentially people become to define who they are and what matters to them in terms of the group. And the stronger someone's identification with the group, the more likely they are to express themselves in ways which reflect that commitment. So in their behaviour, their values, their attitudes, and their dress. So why do people stay in gangs? And these aren't always the same reasons. People might join a gang for a different reason as to why they remain. And that's partly because of the dynamic, the group processes that are involved. We know that there is a really powerful influence that a group has over how someone thinks and behaves. The more identified and more engaged they become with the group. So what we know from social identity theory, for example, is that people start to set aside their own personal needs and concerns. They move away from the things that mattered to them as an individual, and they start to move towards the things that matter to the group. And this is a shared social identity. Essentially, they're categorizing themselves as in and out, so the in-group versus the out-group. And this then gets played out in things like them and us thinking, where people will really kind of define their group as superior. What their group is doing is the best, and everyone else is inferior, and therefore potentially deserves what they get. And the more involved someone becomes, the more likely they are to categorize themselves by this shared identity. So even though it doesn't seem logical, even though people might be at increased risk of violence and victimization and threat, the longer they remain in the group, the more likely they are to become separated from mainstream society and social norms. And that's worth keeping in mind when we think about how we can work with people. So what we're going to do is just bring this to life with a case example. The video is available on YouTube, so we're just going to play a couple of clips from it today. We're hoping that it avoids any ads, but please bear with us if through the joys of using YouTube that we do end up with adverts. But just as a little bit of an introduction, Hezron, as a child, suffered some life-changing burns. So once he came out of hospital, he was badly scarred and was bullied as a result, and he learnt to fight. Whilst this gave him a reputation, he really struggled to control the anger and rage that he felt throughout his life. And this fighting and violence resulted in him being expelled. It really affected the relationship with his mum, and although she sought support from social services, he felt that kind of threat of her leaving really contributed to his anger. And eventually by 13 he was sleeping rough and eventually ended up in emergency accommodation as a 15-16-year-old without any money. And he talks in the bit of the video before the section that we're going to play, where he would scavenge for food, and he describes buying custard creams and that he would lick the cream out of the biscuit before putting it back in the packet, so he always knew he had food if he really needed it. We're going to hear a little bit, and as you listen to the video, just think about some of those push and pull factors and those individual vulnerabilities that Laura alluded to as to why people might join and get involved in gangs. Thank you, Laura.
I started to hang around with a certain group of people, with the wrong crowd. They could see that I had this attitude. They could see that I had this anger problem that I couldn't control. Now these guys are in my flat, chilling, eating out my food out of my cupboard and my fridge. But now I start to hang out with them even more so. We're in the town centre, we're walking around all the time, we're getting up to mischief, causing trouble. And eventually that's how I slowly slipped into gang culture, you know? There was two main gangs in Birmingham. You had Burger Bar Crew and Johnson's Crew. Now these two gangs at that time were probably two of the biggest gangs in the UK, two of the most violent gangs in the UK. So the guys that I knew, maybe their family was quite high up, or their individuals in their family were quite high up, and those were some of the people that I used to hang around with, that I used to roll with. And it was something that I clinged to because I never had it anywhere else. I never had it from family members or anybody else. So I knew that these are the guys that are here for me, you know? I was just a foot soldier, you know? I was just a foot soldier. I wasn't nowhere up in the ranking. But again, I was always putting myself in those situations. I was always putting myself in danger. Led me down the path of having guns and selling drugs and doing crime. I remember the first time I saw someone get stabbed, and it was like, Didn't even faze me. Didn't even faze me. At no point did I stand there and think I'm gonna call the police or I need to help this guy. And I remember it was a guy that I was with. He was a friend at the time, and he was fighting this guy. And then all of a sudden, like, I saw it first, and I saw that actually he had a knife and he was stabbing the guy. And I dragged him, dragged him, and he stood up. And then the guy stood up. The guy that he was stabbing stood up. And he stood up and he was beating his chest and he was like, "You're not gonna kill me, you're not gonna kill me." And a couple of his friends came, put him in the car, and they drove away. And I was stood there like, rah, like, did that just happen? And again, it kind of made me think like, like stabbing people is normal. Like stabbing someone, innit? They're not gonna die, innit? Like I've just watched my man stabbing about 15 times. He ain't dead. I knew right from wrong. I knew the things that I was doing was bad. I knew that. But I never had no one there to say to me, "You know what, Hezron, don't do that, bro. Like, just calm down, or come, let me take you somewhere else and let's do something different." And I'll be honest with you, even though I knew that I was doing wrong, I didn't care. I saw it as nobody cared about me, so why should I care about you? That's how I seen it. And that fueled a lot of the rage inside me when it came to the things that I did. All the little marks on my fingers.
Thank you, Laura. I'll just bring the slides back up. Laura, you're muted.
It was going to happen at some point today, wasn't it?
It was.
So now we understand why some people are drawn to and remain in gangs. What do we know about disengagement from gangs, and how do we as practitioners fit within this? It's important to recognise the very process of disengagement from a gang is highly challenging, and one that can be understood from a multitude of angles. So next slide, please, Vikki. So why do people leave gangs? What brings them to that position? So we have pull factors. So these are the internal factors that make continued commitment to the gang undesirable. And then we have, our push factors, and then we have our pulls. So these are external factors that offer new opportunities. These prevent almost those motivational hooks for change and turning points for those that are engaged with the gang. We know that there will be periods of gang members experiencing the pushes and pulls which can draw them to and away from the gang. And these can happen through a long period of time. Being in that constant state of conflict and that in that position of push and pull. So many of our group members describe a period of teeter-tottering. So this is where they experience almost a contest between gang life and conformity. So I'd like to draw your focus onto disillusionment. So we see there right at the top of those push factors, we've got a reference to disillusionment. This is the most powerful factor associated with driving disengagement from gang association. It's defined as a period of discovery that something is not as good as the person initially thought or anticipated it would be, and this leads to a state of disappointment. So there are 3 types of disillusionment for our gang members that we anticipate they will experience at some point during their process of disengagement. So we've got protective disillusionment. So this is where there was an initial thought or anticipation that the gang will bring safety and security, but then coming to the position where there's a harsh reality that actually gang life is dangerous, and they are more likely to become a victim of attack or criminality in many forms. And then we've got familial. disillusionment. So hoping, as Hezron alluded to earlier, hoping that the gang will provide that sense of family and experience sort of that family unit and that care and protection that individual is looking for in their life. But then flipping that with the reality that the gang doesn't function as a typical family would, and that often your membership within that group is conditional. So in order to be a part of that group, there are certain conditions that need to be met, and that's not typically how a family operates. And also the recognition within that backs can be turned and will be turned. So there's not necessarily that security or that loyalty that individuals anticipated might be the case in joining a gang. And then you've got this economic disillusionment. So this is the harsh reality that the glamorized, somewhat luxury lifestyle that's anticipated is not actually the reality of gang life and being a part of that. The gang doesn't provide the access to the perceived financial gain that the individual was expecting. And that leads to that economic disillusionment. And we know that those disengaging from gangs will experience either one, two, or all three forms of disillusionment as part of that process. And that is the most significant turning point for them when they do experience that. It's important to also recognise that parenthood is a significant turning point for individuals, both male and female. But we do know from research that females are more likely to disengage through reasons associated with the pull factors. So that is more significant for our female gang members looking to disengage and leave gangs. We've got some quotes that we found were quite significant when looking at the idea of moving away from gangs and it's certainly experiencing the stark reality that the gang wasn't everything that person expected it to be. So we'd like to share these with you, and we'd like you to consider the experience of that individual as a gang member moving from what they anticipated right through to the reality that they faced as they moved through the process of disengagement. So our first quote is, "Life is so fragile and unpredictable, especially when you're in a gang. It's like playing poker. You think to yourself that you have a good hand. However, it's only when you actually reveal your hand do you sometimes discover to your horror that someone else's hand is better." And our second quote is from another individual who is disengaged from a gang. "Joining a gang is like skydiving without a parachute. Oh, at first it's all fun as you take on gravity in a thrilling and exhilarating freefall towards the earth. The truth is, anything that's risky and dangerous always starts out as fun. But the odds are always in gravity's favour. You will eventually come face to face with the earth, and Mother Earth always wins those battles. And the same exact thing can be said about being in a gang." So some really thoughtful, thought-provoking, powerful quotes there from individuals who have been through that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So when we start to think about people moving out of gang life then and those pathways out, it's worth recognising that it can be understood both as an event, so an outcome, so someone who holds their hands up and say, yeah, I'm no longer a gang member. So that's the outcome, the event. But it can also be a process that people go through where they start to disengage, they start to disentangle themselves, to decrease kind of how involved they are, and to kind of reverse that shared identity and start to build their own sense of who they are as an individual. So when we think about people and their stages of disengagement, at the one end of the spectrum, you're going to have those people who are fully engaged with the group. At the other end, you're going to have those people who have fully disengaged from that group. And in the middle are those people that Laura was just alluding to, who are teeter-tottering. They're going through that period of questioning, going through those pushes and pulls, and maybe kind of sometimes erring a bit more to the group, and other times a bit more to being disengaged. But what we know from the research is that there are two patterns. So for some people, there is a really abrupt desistance. So they will absolutely knife off and sever all the ties that they have with people associated with the group that they've formerly been involved with. But more commonly is a more gradual desistance. So that kind of process, that drifting away, that involves maybe a series of steps, not necessarily linear steps, but a series of processes that people will go through, where they start to develop beliefs and commitments that counter to the group, and along with those pushes and pulls, help to support their de-identification as a gang member, and they will spend less time with the gang and increase involvement with more conventional activities. So this isn't necessarily free from relapse, it's not necessarily linear, but what it does involve is self-doubt, first doubts, where people begin to build that disillusionment that Laura talked about, where they're having the seed sown that maybe life didn't really play out the way that they thought it would, that the gang isn't giving them what they thought it would, and therefore what other options are there for them. There's also a process of seeking and weighing up alternatives. So this kind of idea of trying on new roles, anticipating socialising in different ways, starting to really question those commitments and challenge some of that underpinning unhelpful thinking that goes with enabling people to offend on behalf of a group. So this is that teeter-tottering that goes on. And actually we know at this point maturation, so just growing older, can be a really key part of this process of trying on new roles. And people also experience turning points. So there might be for some people a specific time or specific event that triggers their consideration or triggers their leaving of gangs. When we looked at the list earlier, so for example, entering custody can be a really significant turning point, or having a child, having new relationships can be those really significant turning points for people that act as that hook for change. And a really important part of this process is creating an X role. So this is where people get that validation, both internally, but also externally, that they have this new role, that they're starting to take on a different identity that's not part of the gang. And this might come from friends and family, it might come from the gang itself through some of those processes that sever relationships, and it might also come from us as statutory authority bodies. But this validation is considered really key in helping to break the ties that bind. But what we also know from the evidence is that declaring yourself as an ex-gang member is not the same as no longer having contact with those former associates. So we know that family relationships, the neighbourhood that people grow up in, are quite significant reasons why people join, and therefore saying that they're never going to have contact with those people again is potentially quite unrealistic. So if we, in our intervention, don't take into account those different levels of connection that someone has, then, and the impact that that has on someone's ability and readiness to break free, we're going to be less successful in the work that we do. So we shouldn't expect gang exit as that outcome in our contact. But what we do know, whilst there isn't a lot of robust high quality evidence out there, what we do see is that an emerging evidence base that R&R, so risk need responsivity based rehabilitation programs, do have an effect. So treated, so those gang members who go through rehabilitation tend to have lower levels of violence in custody or fights and adjudications, dealing with contraband in custody, as well as lower rates of serious reoffending after their release when compared to untreated gang members. So what the evidence suggests is that what we should be doing is exploring why people have bonded with that group or gang and what it has offered them. That we should start to maybe plant the seeds about the realities of that life to help nurture disillusionment, dispel any misconceptions, and challenge some of that influence that the group has over the individual. We really need to work with those motivational hooks that support the process of moving away and disengaging from the gang, such as becoming a father or having a new relationship or new employment. We need to provide support to help sever those unhelpful antisocial bonds while simultaneously promoting those pro-social relationships, which might include resuscitating kind of previous relationships that maybe they've moved away from, but it might also be building new pro-social relationships. So what we're going to do is hear from Hezron again. So as you hear the next clip again, which talks about when he was facing a 10-year prison sentence for violent offences. And as he's talking in this clip, again, listen out for some of those pushes and pulls, for those doubts and those hooks for change that have played a part in his disengagement from the gang. Thank you, Laura.
That was all when I was, what, 16, 17, 18. All because I thought I was a bad man.
So how bad did things get?
I'm looking up to 10 years in prison for a robbery charge. My own friends were sat in the dock at Crown Court testifying against me, telling the court, I don't know him. Never met him before. Never seen him before. And these were guys that I was chilling with, hanging out with. I was the only one that was found guilty because the evidence stacked up against me. And I remember I went for my pre-sentencing report at probation and I met this black woman. I remember, man, first I literally stepped through the door. As I stepped through the door, this woman looked at me and she just went, not another black man. That was the first thing she said to me when I stepped through the door. I'm thinking, who is this woman? It's 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm thinking, who is this woman? Number one. And number two, who is she talking to like that? Like, what's going on? And she looks at me and she says, tell me what happened. Tell me what you did. I looked at her and I said, nah, I ain't no snitch. I ain't telling you what I did. She's like, snitch. She's like, little man, let me tell you something. You can't even be a snitch. She went, your friends have already snitched on you anyway. You're the one that's been found guilty. You're the one looking at prison time. And I'm the person that can help you. And I sat there and I told her what I did. Told her my involvement. Told her about my upbringing, my lifestyle. And she looked at me, she was like, if you go to prison, your life's gonna spiral out of control even more. I left that place thinking this woman was chatting rubbish. I was thinking, I don't know what this woman's talking about. I'm going to prison. That's what I'm still thinking in my head. I end up going to my sentencing, and in my heart's beating. Constant. I'm thinking I'm going to prison for 10 years. But don't get twisted, on the outside, I was cool, calm, collected, sat there like normal. The judge comes in, Mr. Brown, stand up. I stand up. And when I stand up, she looks at me and she goes, I was going to sentence you to prison today. I don't know what you did or who you spoke to, but your pre-sentencing report was glowing. And when she said that, all that I could think about was the woman at probation. All I could think about was what that woman had said to me when she was saying, Hezron, leave it with me. know, when you just think about your life and it just comes back and you just realize that all the things that you've been through in life has brought you to the place that you are now. Sorry, let me do that again.
So what happened next?
So instead, the judge gave me a 2-year suspended sentence, 280 hours of community service, and a hefty fine. And a couple of days later, I was sat in my flat with a friend of mine. And I just looked at him and I had this epiphany and I said, you know, why are we actually doing this? And he looked at me and he said, we're repping the ends, Hez. Repping the postcode, innit? He looked at me and said, Hezron, you're not going to change. I said, what? He said, you're not going to change. You're not going to change from being the person that you are. I looked at him and I said, yeah. Man didn't have that faith in me like I had the faith. But I didn't need him to have faith in me because I knew what steps I wanted to take. I tried to get a job. Little success. Reason why.
Thank you, Laura. So as Hezron alluded to there, he got a job. He completed volunteering opportunities. He did a number of courses. He joined a theatre group, and that all led him to become an ambassador for the Prince's Trust. And that's enabled him to turn his life around, and he's dedicated his life since to working to prevent other people from falling through the same cracks that he did. And the reason that we have used this as an example, Hezron went on to win Pride of Britain Award in 2019 for his work with the Prince's Trust. But what's really interesting is what he recognises as that turning point. And we'll just hear that in the final clip that we're going to play.
It was an amazing moment.
What do you see as being a real turning point for you?
When I went to probation, when I went for my pre-sentencing report, the woman that I met, she could relate to what I was going through. And she knew that by sending me to prison, that was going to make me worse rather than make things better. I don't know how she was so sure, but she was. So all I got to do is just be thankful. I mean, listen, till this day, I've been trying to find this woman just so I can say to her, look at what I've become. That day when you seen me, if you would have just made a different decision on that day, if you would have looked at me and thought, actually, you know what, you deserve to go to prison, I probably wouldn't be sitting here now. Obviously, I speak to a lot of councils now, and when they hear my story and what I've been through, they say to me, oh, Hezron, you was just one of those people that slipped through the net.
Thank you, Laura. So I think, or we'd like to think that the example of Hezron Brown really starts to pull together and illustrate why people become involved in gangs. So the kinds of life experiences that people have, what it is that they're hoping to meet, and how they can disengage from that lifestyle. But what we really want you just to spend a moment or two reflecting on individually is, what was it about that interview with the pre-sentence report writer that helped him open up, that helped him start that process of turning his life around? What did she say? What did she do to help that process? And hopefully from that reflection and that example from Hezron, we can start to see that some of the things that we as professionals can do to help people start to reconsider the relationship that they have with a gang or a group that they have offended with. So the types of conversations that we might need to have is about trying to understand what life experiences they've had. How has that led to and played a part in them becoming involved in that group? What were they hoping to get out of it? What needs were being met by the group? And then starting to sow those seeds about maybe how their expectations, how their hopes differed from reality. So that sense of disillusionment that Laura referred to earlier. And thinking about working in strengths-based, future-focused ways, starting to really explore, so what is it they want their future to look like, both in terms of who they are as an individual, what matters to them, what roles they want to have in life, what relationships they have. So what does their identity look like, and what does their future look like? Because it isn't a single conversation that any one person has that helps to support this process of disengagement. We all have a role and a conversation to play within that. And it's how we approach those conversations that's really critical.
Yes, and when we think about the approach, we know from the work that we do within intervention services and certainly the quality assurance that the approach to how someone engages with those conversations as a practitioner is integral to really supporting that individual to start that process of disengagement. And it's thinking about the expectations and recognising the expectations that you may have as a practitioner entering into that conversation, being aware of those and managing those expectations, leaving them at the door. So when you're going in to have that conversation, when you're going in to meet that individual, it's leaving those expectations at the door and placing that individual at the centre of that, demonstrating that genuine curiosity. What is it that's led that person to that point? Without judgment, thinking about that individual as an expert in their own lives and really understanding what they've been through, what they are going through currently, and what do they anticipate as their future. And really starting to think about the role of the gang and the security or perceived benefits that that gang provides that individual. Once we understand that and appreciate that, we can also recognise that starting the process of even thinking about disengaging from that group, that gang, really leaves an individual in a very vulnerable situation. It's a very emotive time, a conflicting time, and often as a practitioner working with that individual, it's about being prepared for some of those uncomfortable conversations, being prepared for some of that discomfort that that individual is going to experience in their interactions with you, and being empathic about that and really appreciating that it's not as easy or clean cut as moving away and disassociating, and the reasons why, and understanding that complexity. And it's about working alongside that individual. We know from the work that we do and the evidence that we see, working alongside that individual to coach them, to support them through that process is so fundamental to supporting change. Often we also encourage people to consider the language and the terminology that they're using, and knowing that terms such as gang can have quite emotive connotations, can stir up a lot of difficult feelings for people, even being open about their association with a certain group. So it's really about ultimately placing that individual at the centre of your interaction with them, and really demonstrating that commitment to wanting to understand what the gang provides them with or did provide them with, and how we can look at moving things forward at their own pace and at their own level of comfortability. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So that brings us neatly to the end of the information that we wanted to present and share with you. We've got opportunity now for some questions and answers or any reflections that people want to share. So we're happy for people to utilise the chat function if that's available to you, but equally if anyone wants to unmute yourselves, turn your cameras back on and share any reflections or questions, we will do our best to answer them. Sophie, I can see you put your hand up, so feel free to unmute.
Hey, yeah, sorry, I don't think I can do the chat function. Just very early on in the presentation, which was great, by the way, thank you for taking us through all that. You talked about emerging evidence for R&R based programs showing some effectiveness with gang members. Do you have any? Is there any published data on that? Do you have any references or?
Yes, so on the slides we have got a reference list there for you, and there's one by Di Placido in particular, so that I'll make sure is on there, that's a useful reference in relation to that.
And is this international evidence or is this from offending behaviour programmes in the UK in particular? It's
predominantly international evidence.
Okay. Is there any evaluation going on for the suite of programmes here?
So our accredited interventions do go through a process of evaluation as part of maintaining accreditation. So some are in varying stages that we're, given the public nature of some of the presentation, that we're not necessarily able to talk about at the moment.
Okay, but is there a plan to publish in due course?
There should be, yes, when things are available. And Identity Matters has got a process study that is published and available on the internet, which talks about early findings from that, although it doesn't talk about impact in terms of recidivism.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Can't see if anyone else has got hands up, but if anyone else has any questions or reflections. Lisa Sparks, I can see your hand has gone up.
Hi, really sorry. My name, like I said, my name's Lisa Sparks. I'm a postgraduate researcher in Bangor University, and I'm also a lecturer in criminology and criminal justice. Part of my research is female gangs in Wales. Is there any possibility I could get a contact email for you so I can bob you an email later on today?
Of course, yes.
So
if you hold fire at the end, I'll speak to you about that. Yeah,
oh, fabulous. Thank you very much.
Lovely. Any other questions? I can see there's another hand up.
Yes, from Joyce.
Hi, it's Joyce. I'm a probation officer. Yeah, so obviously we do the hands-on work with people who are trying to leave the lifestyle, to exit the lifestyle, but so often you have this moment of kind of helplessness where someone tells you, it's too late for me. I've crossed the line. I do want to leave, but you know, there are things I've done that probably the other people would never forgive, and you find that there are not so many resources to kind of help them along this. So you've done all, you know, done all that you've you know, most of the things that you've talked about, acknowledged, and they're willing to exit, but then it's kind of like there's nothing to exit to. So are there kind of organizations that you could recommend that could help them along that journey?
Yeah, so there are, depending upon which region you're based in, there are a number of very good third sector organisations that can help provide some support in relation to actual exit. And it's a really challenging position, isn't it? And sometimes your heart breaks when you hear kind of phrases like that, and that there's no hope and there's no future. So I think it's also about how we can support other opportunities that are out there as well, and what other tools we've got in our toolkit. So although we're talking about a particular group or a particular kind of cohort, there are things that you already know, and there are things that you can already bring into those conversations to help build that sense of hope for the future, and the small steps that people can take, maybe through, for example, the volunteering opportunities that Hezron alluded to. Laura, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that often, as we've discussed as part of this presentation, that there is a very distinct process about an individual who becomes consumed by the identity of the gang or the group that they're associated with, and often their own values or perceptions of themselves become diminished as part of that. And I think we have a real role in, as I'm sure you are anyway, working with that individual to understand or build a picture of themselves away from the gang. So what is it? Because that is one element of their history and one element of their identity potentially. What do we, or what opportunities can we do to build their understanding of themselves and what they value outside of that gang? What is it that interests them? And using that as a bit of a springboard, if we can get there, to start to think about what opportunities are out there that we can signpost to, really. I can see that Fiona has also got a hand up.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. I'm a teacher in a BCAT local prison, and we have quite a lot of 18 to 19-year-olds and a little bit older. I really like working with them, actually. But is there anything? Are there any particular interventions with it, not just for convicted men, but for people on remand as well, who have got this background? Is there anything that I could look at, or any interventions that I should know about?
Unfortunately, in terms of accredited programs, they typically aren't available when people are on remand. But that doesn't mean that the principles aren't applicable, and I think that's something that we're aware of. I think similar to Laura's response to Joyce's question, it's about maybe the conversations that can be had with that individual. So absolutely, your role in education, in supporting. We know that typically people who are involved in gangs can have quite low educational achievement, quite poor experiences of education. So even providing those positive experiences without it being a structured intervention or structured conversation, or add to those kind of grains of sand that support that process.
Yeah, they are often very bright, and I do exactly what you say, but we have contractual obligations to deliver a curriculum, which doesn't always allow for a huge amount of time for that kind of pastoral talk, but I do my very best. All right, thank you.
Thank you. And Letitia.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I just had a bit of a reflection that I just wanted some input on, if possible, please. When I have worked with people with group membership or gang affiliation, specifically in completing assessments for identity matters, a lot of the feedback I get is the intervention is about disengagement and supporting desistance, and it's not about explicitly moving away from your peer network in the community. But that seems to be in contradiction to a lot of their licensing conditions upon release, which normally state that they can't have contact with people that are gang affiliated. And for the men that I've worked with, that seems to be a bit of a barrier towards gaining their sort of input into the intervention.
Absolutely, and I guess that's the rub sometimes, isn't it, of working for large organisations. So I think it's trying to manage those expectations around what we might hope for, why those expectations and why those licence conditions might be there in the first place, but also then what can we do to support that individual. And I think ultimately it will be an individual case by case circumstance about how to manage and what's appropriate for that individual.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that nicely brings us to 2 o'clock. So thank you for those questions and reflections. Like we said, the recording will be available today, from today, and slides will be made available. I can just see one last question that's gone up. So if people need to leave to go to other commitments, we understand that, but I can see we've got a question, so we're happy to answer that one.
Hi, we were just wondering, obviously, the roll down of Resolve addressing like a lot of identity things in terms of gang membership and things. Resolve being able to offer TSP instead now. Have you had any advice for where to address identity on TSP, or in the shorter time frame being able to build that therapeutic relationship? If you had any advice for how we could sort of develop those relationships to get them to open up about gangs sooner?
So can I ask that you submit that query into our clinical functional mailboxes, and we'll be able to provide some specific guidance?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for everyone's attendance and participation today then.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.